but it was the U.S. incursion into Cambodia in 1970 that provoked unprecedented protest.
I was forced to leave my apartment and actually moved into the White House bomb shelter, which was the only place where they had an extra bed, for a few nights.
One of the campuses convulsing over Cambodia was Kent State, where 4 protesting students were killed by National Guardsmen. Still, the war dragged on. Still, the protests continued. The anti-war movement helped force an end to U.S. involvement in Vietnam, but the country was left drained and divided.
The war in Vietnam caused the split. It was the worst split in our country since the Civil War, and people are not completely over the Civil War.
Jean Meserve, CNN, Washington.
A Vietnam-era story is very telling. A journalist asks a little girl, "What do you know about the war?" "Not much," she says. "It comes on TV after my bedtime." CNN's Mary Tillotson now with reporting on the First Living Room War.
There were no U.S. TV crews even in Vietnam when the first 2 Americans were killed there in July 1959. The story Stanley Carnell filed from Saigon got a few paragraphs in Time magazine.
Of course, never could I possibly have imagined that these 2 names, Buis and Ovnan, would be the first 2 names at the top of the wall in Washington, the Vietnam Memorial, at the head of almost 60,000 other names.
Neil Sheehan, 25 and straight out of the U.S. Army, arrived in Vietnam as a UPI reporter in 1962.
We believed in all those myths of the Cold War, that you had to win this guerrilla war in Vietnam in order to stop this wave of communist-inspired wars of national liberation.
David Halberstam came that year, too, for the New York Times.
Light at the end of the tunnel, everything's on track, boys home before Christmas, all that kind of stuff, and we are the only fly in the ointment. We're the problem. And the real truth is, you know who our sources are? The United States military. But the military in the field, not the bullshit artists in Saigon.
Reporters in Saigon had to compete, too, with reporters in Washington who were fed rosier versions of the war by the Kennedy White House.
I mean, for the first part of the war, the press, especially television, was, remarkably kind of complacent.
Several of my analytical pieces were not run. They were simply killed because they were convinced that I had to be wrong, that it couldn't be, that the authority couldn't be this far out of line.
One of the earliest hints that authority could be came in 1963. An elderly Buddhist monk in Saigon set himself aflame to protest religious oppression by the Diem regime, the same regime President Kennedy had committed America to defend. AP reporter Malcolm Brown photographed the suicide and flashed it worldwide.
In fact, when Ambassador Lodge was sent out to Saigon as Kennedy's new ambassador there, Lodge later told me that Kennedy had my photograph on his desk and said something to the effect that this picture means that we can no longer support the Ngo Dinh Diem government.
That fall, the Kennedy administration acquiesced in a plot that ended with Diem and his brother being killed. Within weeks, John Kennedy himself was assassinated, and Vietnam was Lyndon Johnson's war. He sent combat troops to hold the communists at bay. The military buildup brought a media buildup, too, and the 5 o'clock follies. Barry Zorthian conducted those daily briefings at the height of the war.
My professional relations had a lot of problems, clearly. Skepticism on the part of media, cynicism in many cases, reluctance on the part of the government, of many officials in the government, to be candid with the media.
The most skeptical reporters were the ones who had the gumption to check what was being said in the briefing room against reality in the field.
And we also found out, as reporters do, that if you go down there, not as a VIP, but just go down there and stay down there, people are going to tell you the truth.
Although I have to say readily, the facts on the ground were what finally led to the complete public rejection of the war, not media coverage.
Then came Tet, 1968.
You have this phenomenal trademark picture film of the war of the South Vietnamese police chief shooting the Viet Cong suspect in the head. It's all on television. And everyone back home is saying, my God, what's going on in this place? It's absolute turmoil.
The U.S. was in turmoil, too. CBS anchorman Walter Cronkite went on the air in February 1968 to predict the war that was tearing the U.S. apart would end in stalemate, not victory.
With the Tet Offensive, it seemed that the communists had put a lie stamp right on everything that we had been told from our government.
Opposition to the war elected Richard Nixon president in 1968. He promised to end it, but not before he had his own battle with the press and lost. Neil Sheehan was with the New York Times by 1971 when Daniel Ellsberg offered him the U.S. government's secret central archive of the war, the Pentagon Papers.
It was enormously satisfying from a journalistic point of view, yes, because you were finally giving the public something the public had paid for with enormous treasure, with the lives of their sons.
It was another 2 years before U.S. soldiers left Vietnam, still 2 years more before Saigon fell to the Viet Cong. 1959 to 1975, it was over.
There are conservatives and there are people in the military who like to blame the press for the failure, you know, that we were too pessimistic. That's clearly not true. The war failed because it didn't work. The truth about what we did as reporters is we were not pessimistic enough.
David Halberstam won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the war. So did Malcolm Brown and Peter Arnett of the AP. And so did Neil Sheehan. Mary Tillotson, CNN.
When we return, the story of one family's unraveling by the Vietnam War and efforts to reunite. Not only American families suffered broken hearts and shattered lives because of the war, some Vietnamese who escaped to the USA have been torn apart too. CNN's Frank Sesno has this generation story about a former South Vietnamese government official and his daughter.
Okay, let's go and get this. This guy's saying a silly joke.
Her name is Yu Tai Ton Ya. She calls herself simply Tiana.
Okay, I'm trying to create a little story.
Her little story is really an epic personal journey to reconnect with a homeland she hadn't seen since childhood. A journey she chronicles in her film, From Hollywood to Hanoi.
Do you feel American or Vietnamese?
I don't really know what I am. Sometimes I think I'm an American and sometimes I want to be Vietnamese.
I hadn't been to my auntie's house in over 20 years. I dedicated the film to my father, and really, I would love to take my father back to his homeland.
Patrick Dulong came to the U.S. in 1965 as South Vietnam drifted deeper into war. He had a senior job with the government at Saigon.
The information about their family.
Now he writes and works with troubled Asian youth in California, and he resists his strong-willed daughter's attempts to reach out to the new Vietnam.
I've been opposing communism and socialism per se for years.
Just as she resisted him as a teenager growing up in the U.S., finally leaving her parents' home.
It hurt me a lot, and I miss you a lot, but I had to leave.
Despite Tiana's pleading today, he cannot fathom the idea of returning while those he holds responsible for so much suffering are still in power.
Every day, every night, I pray, my wife and I pray for the communists to turn around, to change their mind, their heart.
For father and daughter, Vietnam remains a battleground, a generational and cultural conflict, a place where past collides with present and future is in heated dispute.
Our country is changing so quickly. If we want to be part of that change, we're educated. We can go back and we could help them. Now's the time. Okay. You're 75 years old. Would you like to go back and see your father's house in Da Nang?
I miss it, but I cannot right now. No way.
It is a conflict that resonates in much of the Vietnamese American community. About suffering and remembrance, loss and forgiveness.
In my film, there was a woman who during the war lived underground in order to survive from the bombs and the bullets. And my cameraman, who's an American, said, "Do you hate us? My government bombed you. You gave birth to your child underground. Members of her family died." And she said, "No." She said, "Because you came back. When you came back with a camera, not with a gun, not with a rifle, not with a bomb, how can I not welcome you? You came from far away. You must care."
But each cares in his or her own way.
And you will only go back if you can practice politics?
Exactly.
Tiana and her father bear their own scars.
How about going back to seeing the minister who introduced you to Mom? How about going back to the school where you went to, that I got to visit your old teacher? Am I just being too emotional here? Am I just...
I'm more emotional than you. But you have to be realistic. I have to be realistic. You, a young, my next generation, have an outlook that is not heavy with experience background.
Their relationship, like their homeland, turbulent and unsettled. But there is change, and maybe, one day, true reconciliation. Frank Sesno, CNN, reporting.
This note, Tiana's documentary debuts in Los Angeles this evening, and that means From Hollywood to Hanoi will be eligible for consideration in the Best Documentary category for next year's Academy Awards. This year's Oscar for documentary feature went to a film about Maya Lin, designer of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Turning points on the timeline of the war when we return. We'll look back at the horror committed against a tiny Vietnamese hamlet in mid-March of 1968, and we'll learn about the aftermath of what happened on a college campus in Ohio, roughly 2 years and 2 months later.
There were a lot of turning points in the Vietnam War, times when Americans decided it was mistaken or wrong. But one of them certainly was when we learned what had happened in a small Vietnamese village, and when we learned that in war Americans were not always the good guys.
They farm up to the edge of the memorial. School children visit, but it's history for them, remote as Auschwitz or hell. Tourists take snapshots. Only the survivors remember all the blood and iron, all the death.